So we are live. So this is the third installment of my series on the question of was the United States founded on Christian principles, for which I continue to blame Mick for the series. He's in the audience here. So let me start. For those of you who are watching online, if anybody is, or watches it on recording and replay, this comes to you thanks to a $40,000 investment the church made in an AV system. And it's expensive to run this system, and we haven't quite raised the money to pay for it yet. So if you are watching from a distance and have not donated to the church, or if you are a church member but still haven't donated to this project, I would encourage you to go to www.holmdelucc.org. That's HOLMDELUCC.org, and find the Giving Portal button in the top right of the screen. $5, $10, $500, $10,000 would help us enormously to make this thing run now and going forward. So if you have given to the capital campaign, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. We can do our services, we can do this, thanks to your generosity. If you haven't, I'd love it if you would do so. Once you're on that giving portal, you can pick capital campaign, or you can pick elevator as your way of donating. It'll go into the funds that pay for this system, as well as for the elevator that we are installing to make our classrooms accessible. So with that done, let me recap the first two sessions very, very briefly, because some of you either online or face-to-face may not have been here. I argued in those two sessions, and I'm going to make three very, very simple points. The question, again, that we're dealing with, was the United States founded on Christian principles? And the answer, in my mind, is no, in case you hadn't gotten that. The reasons it is no is very, very complicated. The reason, first of all, is that the moment the Europeans arrived in the New World, in what became the US, the diversity of Christianity was enormous already. I talked about the Catholic presence in Florida, the Anglican presence in Virginia, the Congregational presence, Puritan presence in New England, the rise of the Baptists, the rise of the Quakers, the rise of the Swedish Lutherans, the Dutch Reform in Delaware and New York, New Jersey area. And the moment the Europeans get here, there's nothing called Christianity. There is the diverse expressions of Christianity, but nothing we can call Christianity. As we move forward, we get to the movement toward independence. We find, again, that the colonies have a dominant Christianity in each of them, most of them at least. Many of them, Virginia, Massachusetts, have an established religion. Many of them don't. But the thinkers who were creating our independence movement were Freemasons. The thinkers were deists, as someone suggested last week. Some of them were practicing Christians, but again, they covered the diverse range of Christianities here in the US. And the principles they followed were drawn largely from the Roman Republic, the pre-Christian thinking about how you govern society. So we have, first of all, an uncertainty about the ability to claim there is a common Christianity on which to build this country. And that's, I think, a pretty important point. After we concluded last week, Mick found me on Facebook and asked me a question. He found reference to a treaty signed in 1796, signed between the United States and a place called Tripoli, which is now in present-day Libya, or we could call them the Barbary Pirates. It was a peace treaty and a treaty of trade. And Article 11 of that treaty expressly says the US is not a Christian country. 1796. It does so, we think. It's a very strange treaty, by the way, and I don't want to go down that road too far, because the Arabic and the English texts are actually rather different, which is somewhat problematic. But the English text says, the US is not a Christian country. We're not going to behave the way those Christians who did the Crusades behaved. And if you think about the Crusades, you think about the shedding of blood, the killing of infidels, the imposition of Christianity on the Arab, on the Muslim world. And the U.S. says, we're not going to do that. So we have early on these, in my view, pretty clear expressions that we're not an explicitly Christian country. Not sure what we are. But let's move to the present day. Or let's move and answer the question a different way now as we move to the present day. And let me ask you a question. Here's where we need the microphones. Let me ask you a question, because Eric, who was not here this time, Eric said, so what are Christian principles? Because he wanted me to answer that question. So let me ask you, O audience of mine, what Christian principles are there that we might found a country on? Who wants to start with that question? Not Joel. Not Reverend Joel, O audience. Who wants to say what Christian principles we might want to found a country on? Paul, you want to start?
Well, I think it goes back to the Ten Commandments.
Okay.
Are those Christian?
Well, hang on. 10 commandments are in the Hebrew scripture.
Yes.
What do they say? They say honor your father and mother, honor the Sabbath, don't steal, don't kill, honor the Lord your God. These aren't in the right order, I'm sorry. Don't covet your neighbor. I said keep the Sabbath, I think, but I'll say it again. What's that, Sue? Or your neighbor's anything, including wife, stuff, slave, whatever else. Am I missing anything? Okay, so that's one starting point. Anything else? So do you have a microphone, Phil?
I have one.
You want to use it?
I don't want to use it right
Okay.
now, no.
Anybody else? Oh, okay, I see. Anybody else? Okay, Joel, got anything? Grab a mic. Let's go for Sue.
So, 10 Commandments are from the Jewish scriptures. If I had to say what the main Christian principles were, I'd say honor the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy mind, and thy strength. And the second is the same. Am I getting this right? To love thy neighbor as thyself. I would say those are the Christian principles.
Okay, so with the comment that was heard was that Jesus actually says, you shall love the Lord your God with all thy heart, all thy mind, all thy soul, and all thy strength, and this is the greatest commandment. And below that, you have love your neighbor as yourself. He says also two things connected to that. One is this is the fulfillment of the law. It is there in the Hebrew scripture also. And he does not come to set aside the law, which means, Paul, yes, the Ten Commandments are part of that, a subset of what Sue just quoted Jesus as saying. Reverend Joel, go ahead.
Well, and I think I could talk for
Don't.
a lot. One thing that transcends both the Jewish and the Christian history is care for the orphan, widow, and the refugee.
Okay.
You know, so those kind of start in the Hebrew scriptures and then carry over into the Christian story as well. So caring for the least in our midst would, I think, would certainly constitute a Christian principle.
So coming out of the Great Commandment, you have bring in those who are excluded, the orphan, the widow, the ones who are broke. If you have two coats, give one away. All of that stuff we think today of as social justice is fundamental, possibly, to Christian principles. Okay, anything else? Go ahead.
Well, I don't want to steal them all, but
Go ahead, Bobby. You try something.
Bobby,
you
did you
mic.
have one? Or?
Well, my thought was just the fact that the question being, what would we consider?
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it's what I, growing up, would have called the red letter parts of the Bible, the teachings of Christ. You base
The
it
actual
on
quotes and things that are in there.
Basically quoted on the things that Jesus told us to say and do. You know, like was already said, you know, he was saying he came to fulfill the law. And having grown up a Southern Baptist, they always said that was the start of a new covenant with mankind.
Mm-hmm.
And that those would be, to me, the Christian principles, and we've outlined most of them just in the last minute or two. So.
Okay, Joe, you want to add one more thing?
Prince of Peace, you know, I'm thinking of Christmas, Handel's Messiah, you know, the Prince of Peace, Counselor, all those kind of things. So being peace-loving, I think, would certainly be a Christian principle.
Peace-loving, sharing, Bobby, and bring into the circle. all of those things. How do you build a government on those principles? We did mention social justice because the combination of Joel and Paul and Sue and I hit that kind of the idea that you need to bring those who are excluded include them. So if I just, well, no one mentioned this little piece called the Sermon on the Mount, but it kind of hits the same thing, doesn't it? This is fundamental to Christian teachings. Is this built into American historical government? I'm seeing a bunch of heads shaking. That's an interesting problem. Some of them are.
I think when they developed the Social Security.
Some of them are at some times and not at other times. Some of them are talked about but not incorporated. Some of them are definitely acted on at various times. Let me go through our history very briefly and see how Christianity has affected American politics. Okay, that makes sense? So we have independence. Let me step back. We have the European founding real quick. Some of us come here thinking God is giving us this land to create the New Jerusalem. We have our independence. We beat the world superpower. Some of us think that is with divine help. We go forward, we continue to own people, which kind of doesn't sit all that well with what we just talked about, although slavery is in Scripture, and so slavery is defensible as a Christian because it's right there. And as we move into the 19th century, the big argument is over slavery. And guess what? The Christian church divides. Many of us say, it's in the Bible, slavery is just fine. Many of us say, no, you can't follow the Great Commandment and have slavery. And so we have, starting in the 1810, a split within Christianity over how to interpret this in terms of these owned people. Very quickly, the question of women comes up also. 1848, Women's Rights Convention. Women want not the vote, they want things like dignity. They want dignity. They say we're all created equal, men and women alike. The Christian church is mostly hostile to that, I will confess. But the Congregational Church ordains the first woman in the 1870s, ordained the first African American in 1760, and stands moving forward for women's rights. Many Christian churches do not, and to this day, some churches ordain women, allow them to preach. Some churches do not. They're all Christian. I'm not hearing a common principle here to work with. Does that make sense? The Civil War. I love the Civil War. I love Abraham Lincoln because someone wrote him a letter and said, "It's okay, President Lincoln, God is on our side." They didn't say don't go to the theater. I wish they had, but they didn't, Paul. And he wrote back saying, I'm not worried about God being on my side. I'm more worried about me being on God's side. What does God really, really call for us? And as you read his second inaugural address, he talks about the horror of slavery and the horror of the war. And he wonders whether the war is as horrible as it is because slavery was so horrible and God is extracting revenge. I could read it. I have the whole thing here. I could read it, but some of you know it already. If you don't know it, every time I go to Washington, I just read that address because it is so remindful of where we were as a quote-unquote Christian country, where a third of us said, slavery is God's right. And 2/3 of us said, no, it's not. And all of us claim different versions of Christianity. Into the 1870s and 80s, something called the Settlement House movement arose. And that movement was put out from a Christian perspective to reach out to the poor, to reach out to the orphans and the widows, to try to give them dignity, give them a leg up, give them a place where they could become real people. You might call that socialist, because you were using resources. Government was supporting it here and there. You were using resources to help the poor. But it turned into something quite a little bit later. At the same time that happened, you had the progressive movement. And if you know the movie The Wizard of Oz, it is a critique of the progressive movement in the 1890s, where you had these claims by poor people, by farmers, by people who were being hard done by the American financial system, claiming they needed to have a new system. Progressives were in some ways socialists at the time, and yet they were claiming divine inspiration for their reshaping American society. And the one that might surprise you is prohibition. Prohibition, the logic behind prohibition is poor people are poor because of sin. Poor people are poor because the working men drink all of their earnings and have nothing to bring home to their wives and children. And we can solve that by getting rid of alcohol, the demon drink. The Methodists are behind prohibition. The Methodists, what's now the United Methodist Church, but it split at some point, think they can solve the problem of poverty. They can engage in social justice by banning alcohol. And they win. To celebrate, they built and they still own the only privately owned building on Capitol Hill. Everything else is government owned. There's one building called Church House, owned by the Methodist Church, watching the government to make sure they're being good Christians. Except how many of us buy into prohibition? Some of us choose not to drink. Very few of us would actually ban alcohol because guess what? Alcohol's in the Bible, isn't it? The first miracle, turning water into wine. I don't understand the theological logic behind prohibition. It makes no sense to me. But it is still, in the American South, a strong movement. So that's a Christian direction that I don't understand. At the same time prohibition was happening, something else was happening. Janice came in and mentioned, what about social justice? And I said, yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. In the 1920s, the US was doing great. You who were there remember the great times, don't you? Okay, I'm exaggerating slightly, but you remember, you've read your history, it was the roaring 20s. But guess what? Waves of immigrants were not getting up. Waves of poor people were being used and abused all over the country. And somebody, a Catholic priest, wrote a book which said the government needs to do something to fix this. The Great Depression struck, and President Roosevelt, who's a Dutch Reform-based president, teams up with this Catholic idea of social justice, and we adopt the New Deal. Unemployment insurance, retirement money, Social Security, more job protections here and there. The government spending money to give work. What's that word again? Socialism? Oh yeah, sorry, socialism. We bring in, and it's completely out of the Catholic idea of charity. There's a flaw in that system. Because the members of Congress who run the committees are all Southern Democrats, steeped in the racism of the American South, the New Deal explicitly and deliberately excludes blacks. So farm workers don't benefit, and that's mostly African Americans. Others here and there don't benefit, deliberately to exclude the African American population. Guess what? These Southern politicians were Christians. So we have again this conflict. What principles are we talking about? The 1960s see another movement arise, the Civil Rights Movement. And who's the leader of that movement? What's his name? No, it's not Martin Luther King. It's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a man steeped, the son and the grandson of Southern Black Baptist preachers. This is a man steeped in Christianity. Reverend Abernathy was there too. Other leaders, all from the churches. Civil rights is a claim by blacks that our Christianity does not include them and should. And we get out of that movement a number of things. We get expansion of the New Deal into healthcare, Medicare and Medicaid. We get anti-poverty programs in the country. And we get a backlash from the Southern whites who are saying, no, remember, these Southern whites are Christians, just as the Northern whites who are pushing this are Christians. So starting in 1964, building in 1968, building more in 1980, you have what's called the Southern Strategy, where Barry Goldwater, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, all say things either very blatant or coded to say, hey, you Southerners who don't like what's going on, switch parties. And the American South, which was Democrat thanks to the Civil War, becomes Republican. These are Christians. These are people who believe in a form of Christianity, one that I don't understand personally, but which is still Christianity. Bobby's arguing with me on that one, I think. He's saying, hey, because you were raised Southern Baptist, were you not? Yeah. She does the microphone, but she's saying that she might dispute whether they actually are Christian or not. We won't need to have that microphone, though, Joe. It's okay. Also in the late 60s, we have the rise of the first gay rights movement. The gay rights movement is not explicitly Christian. In fact, it's rather anti-Christian. However, the United Church of Christ is the first church in America to ordain an openly gay man. An openly gay woman who's actually a good friend of mine, both in about 1980. The first to endorse gay rights, 1985. And the first to endorse same-sex marriage in 2005. So again, Christianity divides, splits. And by the way, I can brag, other churches are now coming over to us slowly, but they are behind us. Yeah, sorry. That was broadcast onto the internet, oh wow. Another movement at the same time, abortion. Abortion is very, very, very complicated. And I'm not going to go into that detail here. But again, the United Church of Christ has endorsed, at the national level, the side of the issue which we might call choice. Many other churches have endorsed the side which is no. Anti-abortion, life, whatever word you want to be using in those. That one is harder to pinpoint as being coming out of principles, I would say, but many of what I've talked about so far has been Christian-based, moving us forward into more and more inclusion into who actually counts. We call that the social gospel. Social gospel was an idea that arose in the 19th century from Catholics, from some of the Methodists and other groups here. What can the church do to change not just individuals, but to change society, to help bring in those who are not already present? Women, minorities, younger people, poor people. So they're pushing the government over the century to expand its access, to expand its support so others have access. Now there's opposition to that also coming out of the church. And one of my students some years ago said that the social gospel is complete bunk. Her attitude, she told me, a good Calvinist. Her attitude was, your life after death is determined before you're born. So what happens now doesn't matter. That's Calvinism, as I said on my first lecture. So for her, The social gospel was just wrong. Is she Christian? She thinks she is. We all think we are, Paul. Paul said that. We all think we are Christian. None of us, and I heard this in a video we did maybe 10, 15 years ago, nobody will call him or herself a heretic, or almost nobody. We all think we're on the right side of God. But we can't all be if we're staying in our own little corner of what this thing means. Is this making sense? So where we are today, and I'm going to end on today and open it up to more conversation for a couple of minutes. Today, we're in 2019. We're moving quickly toward the 2020 presidential election. We have a president right now who has appointed about a third of the federal judiciary. And we have a person in the president, we have a president now who is strongly and extremely supported by the evangelical portion of this country. Okay? Many of us who are in the so-called mainline churches, the United Church of Christ, the Presbyterians, the Episcopal Church, the Modern Methodists, find his politics and policies somewhat problematic. He does not support the immigrants, as some of us think should happen. He does not support the poor in ways that some of us think should be done. So there's a big change in our country's politics, but he still is supported by a large part of the Christian church. And that's, again, confusion about, are we a Christian country? Because what kind of Christian are we talking about? And I'm going to end with two very, very brief comments. One concerns a group called The Family. One concerns a group called Opus Dei. I don't know if you've heard of either of them. The Family was I think they're now disbanded. They were a gathering in the 1990s and 2000s of members of the US Congress. They had a row house in Washington where they met together. They often slept there because they didn't want to have their own apartments. They would just take a room in this row house. And it was organized by an evangelical, fundamentalist, Christian activist who was working very hard to bring like-minded people together, people he called Christians, to change the nature of this country and to bring into existence one kind of Christian dominance. That was exposed after some years of operation at the extent of their connections. They have disbanded, I think, in recent years. But the point that I'm saying is that in the national level, there are groups of people who call themselves Christian who are working very, very, very hard to change how we govern ourselves. That said, there are other Christians working very hard in other directions. And the final thing that I want to toss out here, I said Opus Dei. That sounds Latin, doesn't it? Opus Dei is a Catholic organization, very, very, very conservative, very traditional. They are opposed to women's equality. They are opposed to LGBT rights. They are opposed to a lot of the changes that we've gone through for the last 75 years or thereabouts. And the current head of the Federalist Society is a major, major figure in this group, Opus Dei. And how many of you have heard of the Federalist Society? Anybody? Okay, some of you have. I'll tell you who they are rather than throw the cameras or throw the microphones open again. The Federalist Society is a conservative organization founded in the 1970s, early 80s, the purpose of which is to propose and get confirmation for proper Christian judges. So, Supreme Court has about 4 judges who they approved, who they moved forward. Just a couple of days ago, a Senate committee voted to the Senate floor a nominee from President Trump of an individual who was approved by the Federalist Society. He was called unqualified by the American Bar Association, and he's the 4th one this year to be so identified, and yet being given a lifetime appointment on the on the federal court system. What's the reasoning here? They are anti-abortion. They are anti-gay. They are anti-other sorts of things. They are properly, as they see it, Christian. Now, for most of us in the UCC, they're not properly Christian because they're missing all of these things we talked about early on about what the fundamental principles of Christianity really are. So my whole point is to claim that we are a Christian nation is either to force them to conform to our idea of Christianity, whatever that is, or else it's a complete misunderstanding of the history and current religious complexion of this country. And with that, I'll stop and have a couple minutes for questions before I have to go off to a activity. Anybody want to ask any questions or say anything? Wow, you're all asleep. Hang on, Janice.
The Federalists, this group, and the President Trump nominating certain judges. When you said the bar declared them not qualified for it,
Yes.
and so what happens after that when they?
So the American Bar Association looks at the candidates that the president, whichever president it is, has put out there, and they look at the record. And they say, this person looks like he or she has enough experience to be a judge, has enough of a temperament to be a judge. Judges are neutral in the courtroom, are they not?
They should be.
They should be. Judges know how to run a courtroom, do they not?
Yes.
One hopes. One of the judges recently approved has never argued a case, either civil or criminal, and yet was approved by the Senate to be a federal judge for life. What?
Well, then, why do they independently?
Yes, it's independent. They have no power
They
to.
have no power.
Yeah,
Okay.
they have. I should
That's
say that
what
they
I was
have no
confused
power to
about.
say no. The Senate is the body that confirms or denies, but the American Bar Association for the last year, have any idea how long, Rich, how long they've been doing this? 50 years, 100 years?
I know in New Jersey it's gone on for half a century.
Yeah, so in New Jersey at least, the New Jersey State Bar has advisory power to tell the governor and the state senate that this candidate for a state judgeship is or is not qualified. One assumes the Senate then listens. I'm not sure they do. I don't know enough there. Clearly, yes, they do listen. Do they have authority to overrule it?
That was New Jersey's kind of unique.
Microphone, sorry. Yeah, we have two judges in the room, not two judges, two lawyers in the room here, audience outside.
New Jersey's kind of unique. It was a system set up by the former Justice William Brennan, and it was a gentleman's agreement back, I think, in the 1940s, where they divided up the judgeships between Republicans and Democrats.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a balance there, and yeah, they do have an advisory thing. Occasionally a judge gets rejected, but mostly they're
And
very
when a
well
judge is
qualified.
rejected by the bar, are they rejected by the Senate?
I don't know if anybody's been rejected at the nomination stage, but they have been turned down for tenure, and there's always good reasons for it. It doesn't happen often.
Yeah, New Jersey does not have lifetime appointment. You get a 10-year, and then you have to get renewed, and then you become lifetime. So that's a little bit, there's a chance to stop somebody who's looked good but ended up not being so good. But that's, what's going on today is an attempt by very conservative Christians to impose on the entire country one view, one Christian view of how to run the country. That's not what our tradition really has been talking about for the last 200 and some years. Sir?
Dr. Field, I'm not quite sure how it is that the evangelical movement of I don't even know when you would target it, but the 1970s selected abortion and gay rights as being somebody who was raised in the Protestant tradition. Most Protestants really wrestle with both of these issues. There's good people and bad, or not bad people, but I mean, there's a lot of opinions that go around. And how was it that the Republicans / evangelicals headed towards absolute prohibition on abortion and as well as gay rights. Do you have thoughts on
The
that?
first thing I'll say, that's an entire 3 weeks of my lecture next semester, so I can't go into that in any detail. But very, very briefly, I will say that the Southern Baptists in the 1960s actually tolerated abortion. 1960s, up until Roe v. Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention acknowledged, if not wholly endorsed, a woman's right to have an abortion. And Bobby is saying, yes, she knows that is the case. I don't know the details. Several things happened. 3 things happened pretty much all at once. The first one that happened is Stonewall, the riots in New York in 1969. The second thing that happened in the early 1970s, something called the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. The third thing that happened in 1972 was the federal decision on Roe v. Wade. All 3 of them happening at the same time. Actually, the ERA never actually happened, but the arguments for it made leaders of the conservative churches very alarmed that they were going to lose any authority. And they began to mobilize. They realized we have to take political power to preserve our existence. The previous time we saw these people was in 1925. 1925, you have a court case in Kentucky, which we commonly call the Scopes monkey trial. The Scopes monkey trial was an argument over whether we should have evolution taught in the schools and whether the Bible Genesis story is true or not. You might be surprised about this, but the people who argued do not teach evolution won the case. But the entire country laughed at them in response. And as a result, the evangelicals in this country kind of went and hid behind a rock for 50 years. Because they had that case, they had common literature at the time, all making fun of these country bumpkin type Christian people. And they were kind of embarrassed. They ran their local politics, but not at the national level hardly, not publicly. Stonewall, Roe v. Wade, the ERA, they said, we have to get busy. And so you have the founding of the religious right, you have the founding in 1977, you have the founding of other organizations designed to push this Christian worldview onto the national stage.
What, was it a hard sell? How were the...
Very, very hard sell.
Were the Republicans...
You're not Christian.
Were the Republicans of the 60s actively concerned, moderately interested, didn't really care about, are those the options, or something in between about some of those hot button items? Or so, in other words, did the evangelicals have to kind of sell them on some of these issues?
I'm going to have to say there was a hard sell going on. They had to convince them to do that. It helped that a number of people were wealthy enough to push the movement forward. It's also the case, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s saw a massive realignment of American politics. Before the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-Vietnam War movement, the 2 parties had people who were liberal and conservative in them. You had the Northern Republicans who were relatively liberal, we call them Rockefeller Republicans. You had Democrats in the South who were very conservative. And that's why, as I said earlier, the New Deal was excluding blacks because they didn't want them to be allowed to move forward in our society. Once you get to the Southern strategies that Goldwater, Nixon, and Reagan put together, and you get to the money behind this hard sell and the identification of these are the evils that are destroying America, you began to get a big shift. And the last Republican lost his seat in Connecticut in 2008. We have 1 Republican left in New Jersey now. And if you can see the shifting map of congressional representation as Democrats become much, much, much more the party of the urban, educated, I don't use the word liberal, but, and the Republicans become much more the party of the working class, rural America, which is kind of backwards by our thinking about what the parties actually stand for economically. Anything else? All right, so do you feel enlightened yet? Okay. I think we're frustrated too. John, you turn us off, I think. Thank you all for watching if you're watching
our
online.
Appreciation.